Hello, friends. Tonight, we're stepping back in time to one of the most iconic periods in history, Elizabethan England. Imagine yourself in the heart of London, surrounded by the grandiose and glittering world of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the face of England's glory. Her reign was marked by strength, intelligence, and an undeniable aura of majesty, and she was adored by her people. As the Queen, Elizabeth was the embodiment of beauty, grace, and, perhaps above all, power. She ruled with poise and charisma, commanding both respect and admiration from every corner of her kingdom. But as we wander through the splendid halls of Whitehall Palace, where the finest tapestries hang from the walls and courtiers in their finest attire mingle, there's something you may not have expected: a hidden truth about the Queen herself. Beneath the polished veneer of her royal image lies a story that is far from pristine, one where the harsh realities of hygiene and cleanliness in the Tudor court are revealed in a way that is startling, if not shocking. As the queen of one of the most powerful empires in the world, Elizabeth's image was everything. Her regal appearance, from her elaborate gowns to her carefully crafted wigs, projected the image of an untouchable woman, a symbol of purity and unassailable strength. However, what most people didn't know, what history has only recently started to unveil, was that the Queen's personal hygiene was far from the immaculate picture her court tried to portray. In fact, the truth about Queen Elizabeth's cleanliness might just surprise you. Behind the layers of ornate clothing, extravagant wigs, and countless layers of perfume, there was a very different reality. Elizabeth's beauty was not just natural, it was carefully constructed. Her appearance was part of a larger performance, a performance designed to reinforce her image as the untouchable monarch. Her clothes, though rich with fine materials and embroidery, were rarely washed. Instead, they were brushed and scented with lavender, rosemary, and other fragrant herbs to keep up appearances and mask the fact that they were far from fresh. Perfume, which had been a luxury item throughout Europe, became Elizabeth's personal shield, used liberally to cover up the more unpleasant realities of life at court. The smell of animal fat from candles, the stale fabric, and the body odor that clung to courtiers in close quarters were all masked by the overpowering scent of the perfume. The lavish palace of Whitehall, grand on the outside, was often filled with unpleasant smells on the inside. Elizabeth, revered for her cleanliness and regal stature, had actually become a master of hiding the truth with perfume. Her wigs, which were often heavily powdered, were rarely, if ever, washed. Instead, they were treated with oils and fragrances to keep them looking fresh. The Queen's court was filled with the strong scent of perfumes, masks to cover up what was beneath. This was the illusion of cleanliness, a royal game of deception to preserve the image of purity and dignity. Now, this is where the story becomes all the more fascinating. Beneath the sweet fragrance and powdered wigs, Queen Elizabeth I's personal hygiene was not the idealized version you might expect from a queen of her stature. In fact, during her time, bathing was considered an unnecessary luxury, even dangerous, due to the belief that water could open pores and allow disease to enter the body. Elizabeth herself, despite her powerful position, did not bathe regularly, choosing to rely on perfumes and powders instead. Her teeth, despite her noble status, were decayed due to excessive sugar consumption, and her breath carried the lingering smell of neglect. To cover this, she would use perfumed gloves and handkerchiefs to mask the odor. Her body, though cloaked in royal attire, was far from untouched by the harsh realities of hygiene at the time. It was a fascinating and troubling contrast. The Queen, whose image was projected as the embodiment of purity, was in fact hiding the truth behind layers of perfume powdered wigs, and carefully curated appearances. And here, dear listener, is where we begin to uncover the fascinating and often shocking details of Queen Elizabeth's royal hygiene habits. How did Elizabeth's court life, her image as the Virgin Queen, and the very role of cleanliness play into the politics of her reign? What does it tell us about the lengths she and her court went to maintain the illusion of untouchable purity? So, settle in as we step deeper into the world of Elizabethan England, where the illusion of royal cleanliness was both a personal and political tool, and discover the truth about Queen Elizabeth's hygiene, a secret that, for centuries, remained hidden behind layers of fragrance, luxury, and royal authority. Stay tuned as we explore the surprising reality behind the Queen's most well-kept secrets. In the splendorous halls of Elizabethan England, Queen Elizabeth I reigned as the embodiment of royal dignity, untouchable beauty, and unrivaled power. Her subjects revered her as the Virgin Queen, the symbol of England's glory. With her golden red hair, majestic gowns, and impeccable presence, to the world, she appeared as a paragon of grace and purity, a woman untouched by time. However, behind this carefully cultivated image of cleanliness, the truth about Elizabeth's personal hygiene was far from what one might expect from a monarch of her status. The regal appearance of Queen Elizabeth was not merely an accident. It was a carefully crafted performance. Every detail of her appearance, from the elaborate wigs to the heavy gowns, from her porcelain-like skin to the floral fragrances that enveloped her, was meticulously planned to project an image of perfection. But in reality, Elizabeth's hygiene habits, like much of her court's daily routine, were far from pristine. In an age when bathing was considered both a luxury and a potential health hazard, Elizabeth adhered to a common belief that water could open the pores and make her vulnerable to disease. This fear, based on the ancient and widely held medical theory of the miasma, which suggested that bad smells and air were responsible for illness, shaped much of Elizabeth's daily life. As a result, she and her court avoided bathing, believing it to be not only unpleasant but also dangerous. The Queen's aversion to water and cleanliness was far from an isolated phenomenon. At that time, bathing was something that was feared, not desired. Rather than embracing water as a method of cleanliness, Elizabeth chose an alternative: perfumes. Her reliance on perfume as a substitute for bathing became one of the most iconic elements of her image. These lavish perfumes were used not only to mask the natural body odors of sweat and dirt, but also to create an overwhelming, almost intoxicating scent that defined the court atmosphere. Roses, lavender, and other sweet-smelling flowers filled the air around Elizabeth, masking the odor of her unwashed skin and clothing. The perfume was not just a fragrance, it was an essential tool of political and social survival. But Elizabeth's reliance on perfume did more than just mask the reality of her hygiene. It served as a symbol of her royal status. In an era when cleanliness was more about appearance than true hygiene, perfume became an essential part of the royal image. The heavy scents she wore were a mark of her distinction. Her ability to afford the finest perfumes that symbolized both her wealth and her purity. However, this perfumed exterior concealed a different reality, one of unwashed clothing, unclean skin, and wigs that were never washed. Elizabeth's elaborate wigs were an integral part of her royal appearance. They were crafted with great care, adorned with jewels and pearls, and styled to perfection. But like her clothing, these wigs were never washed. In a time when the idea of clean hair was far removed from the royal court's expectations, Elizabeth's wigs were powdered heavily with flour and perfumed to maintain their fresh appearance. The wigs, often designed to add to her imposing presence, became a symbol of her ability to mask the truth of her personal care. These wigs, as immaculate as they appeared, were not hygienic by modern standards. They were essentially the same as a carefully crafted facade, both beautiful and deceptive. Her court, though magnificent and a beacon of power, was not a place of sanitary excellence. The reality was that much of the clothing in Elizabeth's court was never truly washed. The rich fabrics and costly gowns were often brushed and scented, but the cleaning process was limited to ensuring that the outer layers appeared pristine. Washing was a laborious and costly task, and many members of the court, including the Queen herself, were content with this shallow form of cleanliness. They relied on brushing and scenting their clothes, but the idea of washing with water and soap was foreign to them. Instead of seeking true cleanliness, Elizabeth and her courtiers placed greater value on maintaining the appearance of cleanliness, using scent and appearance as tools to create an illusion of purity. This obsession with appearance extended beyond clothing and wigs. The Queen's delicate skin was another element of her royal persona that she worked tirelessly to maintain. Elizabeth's face, often regarded as one of the most beautiful in England, was covered daily with thick, lead-based makeup. The makeup was not only intended to keep her youthful appearance intact, but also served as a symbol of her divine purity. To maintain her pale complexion, Elizabeth applied layers of white makeup made from toxic lead and mercury, which were known to damage the skin over time. Despite the physical harm it caused, Elizabeth continued this practice because it was integral to her image as a monarch. Behind her painted face, however, there were signs of decay. Elizabeth's teeth, weakened by the sugar-laden diet that was common among the nobility, began to rot and decay. The Queen, in turn, hid her decaying teeth and the foul breath that accompanied them by using perfumed gloves and handkerchiefs. It was a delicate performance of mask and concealment. Elizabeth's daily rituals were not just about appearance, but also about crafting an image of perfection and purity, even if it came at the cost of her health. In a court that placed immense importance on outward appearance, Elizabeth's hygiene habits reflect the larger cultural values of the time. Hygiene, in the Elizabethan era, was not about true cleanliness, but about the appearance of cleanliness. It was an idealization that served as both a personal and a political tool. The Queen's reliance on perfume, wigs, and makeup was a manifestation of the time's understanding of cleanliness as a surface-level endeavor. The deeper realities of personal care were overshadowed by the political necessity of projecting an image of purity and grace. But perhaps the most shocking truth about Elizabeth's hygiene was the stark contrast between her royal image and the reality behind it. Despite being revered for her beauty and cleanliness, Elizabeth was often surrounded by discomfort and filth. The palace, Whitehall, where the Queen spent much of her time, was grand and majestic on the outside, but far less glamorous on the inside. The palace was crowded, warm, and filled with the smells of sweat, animal fat, candles, and unwashed fabrics. The scent of perfume masked the stench of body odors, creating a thick, inescapable atmosphere that permeated the air. Yet, this combination of perfumes, powder, and layers of clothing was not just a matter of personal vanity. It was a reflection of the broader social and political structure of the time. In a society that was so obsessed with maintaining a strict hierarchy, the ability to afford such luxuries as perfume and heavy clothing was a way for the upper classes to reinforce their position. For Elizabeth, the perfume was not just about masking her own odors. It was a symbol of her royal status and her ability to command the respect of her subjects. It was a tool that allowed her to present herself as the pure, untouchable monarch that she needed to be, while her subjects were left to live in their own filth and struggle with basic hygiene. The queen's reliance on perfume, makeup, and heavy clothing represented not only a political necessity, but also a social construct designed to maintain her stature. It was a deliberate choice to elevate her status above the rest, hiding the realities of everyday life behind a veil of scent and beauty. And so, in the end, the illusion of cleanliness created by Elizabeth's reliance on perfume, wigs, and painted skin was just that, an illusion. Behind the royal facade lay a monarch who, like all people of her time, struggled with the same bodily needs and hygiene issues that everyone else faced. But she was able to mask it, not with water and soap, but with the magic of appearance and perception. And in doing so, she solidified her place as one of the most powerful and iconic figures in English history. In the grand and opulent palace of Whitehall, Queen Elizabeth I held court, the very symbol of royal majesty and power. The towering stone walls and gilded decor presented an image of wealth and splendor. Yet behind the palace's impressive facade, the reality of the royal living quarters was far less glamorous. The air inside the palace was thick, not with the fragrance of freshly bloomed roses or the scent of luxurious perfumes, but with the pungent smells of sweat, animal fat, and body odors. The grand corridors and richly decorated chambers were far from the clean, fragrant spaces one might imagine in a palace. Instead, they were often permeated by the unmistakable stench of an environment where hygiene was not a priority. Whitehall was bustling and alive with activity, hosting courtiers, servants, nobles, and visitors alike. It was a vibrant place, full of energy and purpose, but it was also incredibly crowded. The rooms were crammed with people who rarely had the time, the means, or even the knowledge to maintain cleanliness in the way we understand today. The palace had many rooms and halls, but the lack of ventilation in some spaces meant that the air became stagnant and thick. The smell of sweat lingered in the hallways, clinging to the tapestries and velvet curtains. The large fireplaces that were used to keep the rooms warm during the cold months often added to the heaviness of the air. Smoke from animal fat candles filled the space, mixing with the natural scent of the body and fabrics. The stench of unwashed bodies, which was common in the era, combined with the smoke and scent of food, created an overwhelming atmosphere. While the outside of Whitehall was grand, decorated with lavish gardens and courtyards, the inside was, in many ways, a reflection of the era's understanding of cleanliness, one that did not prioritize hygiene as we know it today. The palace was meant to house the queen and her court, with vast spaces dedicated to governance, entertainment, and politics. Yet, amid all the political grandeur, the palace's interiors were nothing like the pristine, air-conditioned spaces we may imagine in modern royal homes. The lack of sanitation and ventilation led to a smell that seeped into the very fabric of life inside Whitehall. Despite the discomfort of the air, the palace's residents were adept at masking the odors, particularly the queen herself. Elizabeth I was keenly aware of her image and reputation. She understood that her public appearance was as much about politics as it was about royal status, and she used scent as one of her most powerful tools to control and manage this image. Perfume, to Elizabeth, was not simply a cosmetic tool, it was a political statement. It was a way to shield herself from the unpleasant realities of palace life and maintain the illusion of purity, grace, and beauty. Perfume was liberally applied throughout the palace, especially by the queen. As Elizabeth moved through the corridors, Her presence was often accompanied by the sweet scent of roses, lavender, and exotic florals. The fragrance masked the more unpleasant smells that filled the air. But this use of perfume was not just to cover up body odors or the stale air. It had a much deeper purpose. The perfume was a reflection of royal power and wealth. It signaled to anyone in the queen's presence that she was of higher status, untouchable by the grime of ordinary life. It was a symbol of her authority and her careful curation of her public persona. By wearing perfume, Elizabeth was actively creating an image of herself that was not grounded in reality, but in an idealized form, a monarch who could do no wrong, untouched by the mundane discomforts of ordinary life. The use of perfume was also strategic in maintaining the queen's royal distance from the people around her. While courtiers and servants lived in close quarters and were subject to the same uncomfortable smells and living conditions, Elizabeth was able to set herself apart. She wore layers of perfume and scented oils, not just for personal hygiene, but as a way to emphasize her superiority. For those in the Queen's court, the fragrance that lingered in the air became a reminder of her exalted position, a subtle but constant reinforcement of her power and status. But while perfume served as a tool for masking the less savory realities of court life, it also became a metaphor for the Queen's entire reign. Elizabeth I's reign was a period of magnificence, a time when England stood at the height of its power. Yet this grandeur was often at odds with the harsh realities beneath the surface. The palace was a stage for royal performance, and perfume, in this sense, was the perfect symbol of the Elizabethan court, carefully constructed, designed to impress, and capable of hiding what was less flattering. For the courtiers, those in attendance at the royal court, the use of perfume was not just a luxury, but also an expectation. To be at court meant to participate in the illusion of cleanliness and refinement. Everyone in the Queen's inner circle had to match the standards set by her. In fact, many of the courtiers would have worn their own heavily scented garments, perfumes, and oils to mirror the Queen's own use of fragrance. In this way, scent became not only a personal statement, but a social currency. To not adhere to these fragrant practices was to risk being excluded from the Queen's presence or from the social circles that revolved around her. However, for all the grand displays of wealth and status that perfume represented, the reality inside Whitehall was that the courtiers were no less susceptible to the dirt and grime of everyday life. The perfumes they wore may have masked the odors of sweat and unwashed bodies, but beneath the fragrances, they too had to endure the discomforts of the palace's poor hygiene practices. The lack of clean air, proper sanitation, and the constant proximity to others in such confined spaces meant that everyone in the court, no matter their rank, had to endure the same oppressive atmosphere. And so, while Queen Elizabeth and her court went to great lengths to create an image of cleanliness and grace, the reality inside Whitehall was far different. The air was thick with the combined smells of perfume, smoke, and sweat, and despite all efforts to mask it, the stench of the palace was something that could never be completely hidden. Yet this paradox, the beauty of the external appearance paired with the stench of the internal reality, perfectly encapsulated the tension at the heart of Elizabethan court life. The palace, with all its grandeur and power, was still subject to the same physical limitations as the rest of the world. And though the Queen's perfumes may have disguised the truth, the reality was always just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The court of Queen Elizabeth I was a place of grandeur, steeped in both political power and aesthetic beauty. Every day, courtiers and dignitaries from across the land gathered to bask in the Queen's glow, witnessing the magnificence of her reign and the brilliance of her court. Yet, behind the polished performances and royal ceremonies, there was a less glamorous reality. The palace was alive with the sounds of bustling servants, whispering courtiers, and the ever-present crackle of the fire. But amidst this activity, there was something else, the unmistakable, ever-looming presence of odor. Court life, under Queen Elizabeth's watch, was an elaborate affair. She was the image of perfection, an untouchable icon who wore her power with grace and poise. Yet, in a time when hygiene was barely understood, Elizabeth's court became a battleground with odor, where perfume and herbs played a pivotal role in the ongoing struggle for cleanliness. Herbal scenting was the first line of defense. It wasn't uncommon for the clothing of the queen and her courtiers to be carefully scented with herbs like lavender, rosemary, and thyme. These herbs were much more than pleasant fragrances. They were a necessity. Lavender was thought to purify and protect, while rosemary had long been believed to ward off evil spirits. To the courtiers, it was not just about smelling nice. It was a constant, exhausting battle to mask the reality of body odor, sweat, and the lack of bathing. The very clothing they wore became part of the disguise, as layers of garments were brushed and then scented to create the illusion of cleanliness. The courtiers, always eager to please the queen, had learned to embrace the perfume-scented armor. Elizabeth herself, the Virgin Queen, stood as the paragon of immaculate beauty and grace. Her fragrance was the most intoxicating of them all, a carefully curated blend that followed her wherever she went. It wasn't just a scent, it was a statement. It was royal, it was powerful, and it was the essence of Elizabeth herself. The Queen's signature scent was composed of the finest perfumes, some with notes of roses, musk, and amber, mixed in the perfect balance. As the Queen moved through the court, her scent was like a mark of royalty, a scent that spoke of purity, nobility, and status. It was a reflection of her eternal youth and the carefully crafted image she worked tirelessly to maintain. For the courtiers, it was an act of loyalty, a way to show deference to their queen. They mimicked her perfume, copying not just the scent but the way she carried herself, her speech, and even her mannerisms. To be in her presence was to be in awe of her. To imitate her was a way to show one's devotion to the crown, a means of securing favor and perhaps a chance at royal advancement. But this ritual of perfume-scented clothing and artificial cleanliness did not erase the underlying issues at court. The reality of daily life at Whitehall was that even though the courtiers wore their finest perfumes, and the palace was filled with the fragrance of lavender and roses, the stench of the palace could not be ignored. Despite the layers of scent, the air inside the palace was thick with the smell of smoke from the ever-burning fires, the pungent odor of sweat from the crowded rooms, and the stale scent of unwashed fabrics. The fire, constantly stoking the hearths, left behind an acrid smell of burnt wood and smoke that mixed with the perfumes, creating an overpowering scent that could not easily be masked. The Queen's court, with all its splendor, was often damp and poorly ventilated. The rooms where the courtiers gathered to drink, dine, and discuss affairs of state were not always blessed with the kind of cleanliness one would expect in a modern palace. In fact, the reality was far less pleasant. The crowded halls, the constant coming and going of servants, the lack of personal hygiene, and the absence of proper ventilation meant that the air in the palace was often stifling. Despite the many efforts to mask the odors with perfume and herbs, they were not enough to cover the sheer volume of human activity and the absence of basic sanitation. The rich tapestries hanging from the walls, meant to serve as insulation against the cold, did little to help with the oppressive atmosphere. The courtiers, the noblemen, the attendants, none of them were immune to this constant battle with smell. Even though they tried their best to mask it, the odors would seep through the finest perfumes. The heavy gowns and intricate silks, laden with scent, could not conceal the human sweat that had built up throughout the day. The wigs worn by the noblewomen, finely crafted and set in elaborate designs, were powdered with the same perfumes. Yet these too were a source of odor. As the wigs were rarely cleaned, the perfume merely masked the scent, but it didn't hide the reality that these wigs were heavily coated with oils, powders, and chemicals that only added to the overwhelming sensory experience of the court. Despite the layers of perfume and fragrance, the court was still a place where the battle with odor was never truly won. Even as the courtiers attempted to keep their distance from the scent of the palace's air, the reality was that perfume was just a temporary solution. The smell of smoke from candles, the scent of meat roasting on spits, and the lingering odors of human bodies and fabrics all mixed into a potent, inescapable aroma that followed the courtiers wherever they went. The battle to stay clean, to smell right, was one that was fought daily and was as much about survival as it was about maintaining status. In many ways, the use of perfume and the attempt to mask the reality of the situation became symbolic. The Queen's fragrance represented more than just cleanliness. It was a form of royal mystique. It was a way for Elizabeth to assert her authority, to create the illusion of purity and grace, while simultaneously obscuring the uncomfortable truths of life at court. The courtiers, too, had to maintain this illusion, following the Queen's example to avoid being seen as unworthy or unkempt. In the end, the reality of court life, no matter how fragrant it seemed, was one of discomfort, struggle, and endurance. The perfumes that masked the odors of sweat and grime were as much a political tool as they were a means of survival in a world where cleanliness was not yet fully understood. Even as the perfumes filled the palace air, they could never truly erase the deeper truths of life at court, where hygiene and personal care were secondary to appearances and the demands of royalty. The smells of the court of Queen Elizabeth I were as complex and layered as the perfumes that were used to cover them. They told a story of a time when appearances were everything, and the battle against odor was just one of many battles fought in the world of politics, status, and survival. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was more than just a ruler. She was the embodiment of England's strength, grace, and political might. Her image, carefully cultivated over her reign, became an icon of beauty and power. But behind the flawless portrayal of the Queen lay a darker, more uncomfortable truth about the toll that her pursuit of perfection took on her body. In a time when appearance was paramount to political success, Elizabeth's rituals of beauty were as much a matter of statecraft as they were of personal vanity. She was revered not only for her political acumen, but also for her youthful and radiant appearance, which she maintained for much of her reign. But this youthful appearance came at a steep cost, one that she and her courtiers went to great lengths to hide from the public eye. Elizabeth's beauty routine was meticulous, and it began with the application of cosmetics that were far from harmless. The foundation of her porcelain-like skin was achieved through the use of lead-based white makeup, a popular cosmetic choice at the time. This thick white paste, known as Venetian ceruse, was made from lead, a substance that is now known to be highly toxic. The makeup gave her skin the smooth, luminous quality that was so highly valued in Renaissance beauty standards. However, the constant application of this toxic substance slowly poisoned Elizabeth, as lead was absorbed into her skin over time, causing irreparable damage to her body. But the lead-based makeup was not the only dangerous product in her cosmetic arsenal. To add a flush of color to her cheeks, Elizabeth used mercury-laden rouge, another toxic compound. Mercury was widely used in cosmetics at the time for its ability to create bright, vivid hues, but it was also incredibly harmful to the body. The Queen's repeated exposure to mercury through her rouge would have contributed to a slow, damaging poisoning process that could have affected her nervous system and internal organs. Despite the risks, the Queen's pursuit of beauty and her desire to maintain an untouchable, youthful image outweighed the dangers of the makeup she used. In addition to the damage to her skin from the lead and mercury, Elizabeth's excessive consumption of sugar led to another hidden problem: severe tooth decay. At a time when dental care was rudimentary at best, the Queen's fondness for sugary treats left her teeth in a state of disrepair. Historical accounts suggest that Elizabeth had a notoriously bad set of teeth, which caused her significant discomfort. Her teeth, once white and even, had become discolored and rotten, and her breath was often described as foul. To mask the stench of her decaying teeth, Elizabeth used perfumes and carried a handkerchief with her at all times, discreetly holding it to her mouth to cover the unpleasant odor. Despite the toll that her beauty, routine, and diet took on her body, Elizabeth's image remained untarnished in public. Her court portraits, painted by some of the most talented artists of the day, were carefully constructed to show only the Queen at her most radiant and regal. These portraits, idealized and flattering, concealed the physical toll her beauty regimen had on her body. They showed her as the Virgin Queen, eternally youthful and untouched by time. Yet they were a far cry from the reality of the Queen's aging, poisoned body. The portraits of Elizabeth were not just works of art. They were political tools. As the head of a nation, Elizabeth had to maintain an image of vitality and strength. In a world where rulers were often judged by their appearance, especially monarchs like Elizabeth, her ability to maintain the illusion of youth was central to her power. The portraits depicted her as a symbol of England's strength, unshaken by time or age. She was the embodiment of a powerful, everlasting monarch who had withstood the challenges of her reign. In reality, however, her appearance was slowly deteriorating, and the portraits concealed the physical suffering she endured to keep up appearances. The Queen's obsession with maintaining this image was not limited to her face. Her hair, too, was carefully crafted to fit the ideal of beauty. Elizabeth's famous red hair, which was seen as a symbol of her royal power and divinity, was styled in elaborate wigs that were coated with powders to give them volume and texture. These wigs, however, were never washed. Like her other cosmetic practices, they were designed to keep up appearances while ignoring the underlying consequences. The wigs became another layer in the mask Elizabeth wore, hiding the reality of her aging body beneath a carefully constructed illusion of perfection. The rituals surrounding Elizabeth's appearance were not only about vanity, they were a necessary part of maintaining her political and social position. Her public persona was carefully curated to ensure that she remained a symbol of youthful, eternal power. To be seen as anything less than perfect would have undermined her authority and potentially threatened her reign. This pressure to maintain her appearance at all costs was not just personal, it was political. Elizabeth's use of toxic makeup and her efforts to maintain the illusion of youth at all costs reveal much about the pressures faced by the Queen and other rulers of the time. The pursuit of beauty, despite the dangers, was intertwined with political survival. For Elizabeth, looking young and untouchable was not just a matter of personal vanity, it was a matter of state. It was a way to maintain her authority and to keep her subjects in awe of her, preserving her position as the figurehead of a powerful nation. But as we reflect on Elizabeth's beauty routine, we must also acknowledge the cost. While she may have succeeded in maintaining an idealized image of youth and power, the toll it took on her health was undeniable. Elizabeth's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of vanity and the lengths to which people will go to maintain an image, even at the expense of their own well-being. Her reliance on toxic substances, unhealthy eating habits, and the constant pressure to uphold an image of eternal youth serve as a reminder of the societal pressures placed on women, especially those in positions of power. In the end, Queen Elizabeth I's beauty rituals were not only a reflection of her reign, but also a reflection of the times in which she lived. A time when image, power, and politics were inseparable, and when appearance could be as deadly as any weapon. Her story is one of strength, but also of sacrifice, a sacrifice that ultimately led to the deterioration of her body in service of her throne. Queen Elizabeth I, like many monarchs before and after her, understood the power of image, an image that was not merely personal vanity, but a matter of national importance. In an era where the appearance of the ruler often reflected the strength and prestige of the nation, Elizabeth's hygiene and appearance became intricately tied to her authority. However, what we now consider to be proper hygiene was far from the concern of this great monarch. In her world, cleanliness was less about health and more about social standing and the performance of royal power. The very rituals of hygiene in Elizabeth's court were an elaborate play, with perfumes and powders taking the place of actual cleanliness, masking the truth of her court's less than ideal sanitary conditions. For Elizabeth and her courtiers, the art of cleanliness was an act. Bathing, for instance, was largely avoided. It wasn't a matter of preference, but of belief. The Queen's personal hygiene was dictated by the understanding of the time, which was deeply intertwined with superstition and medical misconceptions. The common belief held that water, especially in large quantities, could open the pores, allowing not just the cleansing properties of the bath to enter the body, but also harmful, disease-carrying vapors. Bathing was viewed with suspicion, even danger. To immerse oneself in water was to risk falling prey to illnesses or, in the worst cases, death. Thus, Queen Elizabeth and her court turned to what was, in their eyes, a safer alternative: perfumes, powders, and aromatic oils. These fragrances, which seemed harmless and even desirable, were used as much to mask the natural odor of the human body as they were to maintain the illusion of cleanliness. Elizabeth, known for her regal demeanor, did not smell like the common folk. Her scent was part of her persona, just as much as her hair, her face, and her clothing. She was the Virgin Queen, a symbol of England's greatness, and her appearance needed to reflect that. The delicate, perfumed air around her was not just about masking unpleasant smells. It was about projecting a sense of purity, of divine grace, and of power. Her scent became a form of ritualistic armor, symbolizing both her sovereignty and her purity. It was a tool for the Queen to maintain the image of a goddess-like figure, untouched by the same physical realities that plagued her subjects. Perfume, in Elizabethan England, was not merely cosmetic, it was a political statement. For the Queen, it served as a subtle yet unmistakable reminder of her exalted position. Nobles in her court adopted similar practices, dousing themselves in expensive perfumes that signaled wealth, status, and proximity to the monarch. It was a way of belonging to the upper echelons of society. By using the same fragrant concoctions as the Queen, the nobility could show their loyalty and affirm their position within the royal sphere. Perfume became, in essence, the invisible marker of class and power. It wasn't just about pleasing the senses, it was about reinforcing the rigid social hierarchy that defined Elizabethan England. However, the reliance on perfume and powders as substitutes for actual cleanliness had far-reaching implications, not just for the appearance of the queen, but for the society at large. The entire court, from the queen to her servants, took part in this complex performance of cleanliness. It wasn't enough to wear clothes. Those clothes had to be maintained in a certain way. In Elizabeth's world, clothing was rarely washed. Instead, garments were brushed and scented with herbs, such as lavender and rosemary, to disguise the odors of sweat, dirt, and oil. The use of these herbs was not just about keeping garments fresh, but about maintaining an image of cleanliness. This was true for the queen's personal attire, which, like her body, was shrouded in layers of perfumes and powders. The queen's appearance, her rituals, and her hygiene practices became a carefully orchestrated performance. This performance was not just about physical appearance, but was also about asserting her political power and divine right. Elizabeth's refusal to bathe, her obsession with perfumes, and the elaborate layers of scented garments she wore were all part of a wider strategy of controlling how she was seen by the public and the court. The queen's scent, sometimes described as a combination of roses and musk, was as integral to her image as her iconic red hair or her stiff regal posture. It was her signature, a smell of power and grace that hung in the air wherever she went. But beyond the perfume, the true nature of her hygiene practices reveals a much more complex, darker side to Elizabethan court life. The contrast between the queen's pristine image and the reality of her court's hygiene practices could not be starker. Beneath the surface of carefully applied perfume, there were lingering smells of sweat, unwashed bodies, and a general disregard for personal cleanliness. But to acknowledge such odors would be to disrupt the carefully constructed illusion of royal purity. In this sense, cleanliness became an artifice, a performance that was essential to the power structure of Elizabethan England. It wasn't just about the queen. The entire court was involved in this practice of masking odors and maintaining an image of cleanliness. Elizabeth's courtiers, eager to gain favor and imitate their queen, followed her example. Perfume became a kind of social currency, a tool for navigating the complex web of relationships at court. It wasn't enough to merely smell good. It was essential to smell like the queen, to wear the same fragrances, to share in the same rituals of cleanliness, as a way of demonstrating loyalty and belonging. Despite these efforts, the palace was still filled with the smells of the human body, of sweat, of unwashed clothing, and of the raw materials used in everyday life. The truth was that even for the wealthiest in Elizabethan society, hygiene was never fully attainable in the way we think of it today. The need to mask unpleasant odors was more than just about personal vanity. It was a symbol of status, a reflection of the queen's power, and a mechanism for maintaining the social order. In a world where appearances were everything, Elizabeth's hygiene rituals were a crucial part of the persona she projected. Perfumes and powders weren't just used to mask the smell of uncleanliness. They were a declaration of her status as queen, as an untouchable figure above the dirt and the grime of everyday life. Yet, beneath the surface, the use of such substances was not without its dangers, and the reliance on them to conceal the realities of personal hygiene reflects the deeply ingrained cultural and political pressures of the time. Elizabeth I, in her dedication to preserving her image, used the tools at her disposal to create an aura of purity and divinity. But in doing so, she contributed to a larger societal performance, one in which cleanliness was more about illusion than reality. The elaborate rituals surrounding her appearance, the use of perfume and scented oils, were not simply personal vanity, but essential components of her reign. They were woven into the very fabric of her power, reinforcing her image as the Virgin Queen, the embodiment of England's strength and glory, despite the physical toll it took on her health. In the end, Elizabeth's hygiene practices serve as a fascinating reflection of the time she lived in a world where image was paramount and the line between truth and illusion was often blurred. The Queen's reliance on perfume to mask the realities of her body was not just about beauty. It was about control, power, and the need to maintain an image of invincibility. In a way, it was a symbol of the lengths to which rulers would go to preserve their reign, no matter the cost to their personal well-being. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was the symbol of England's glory. Revered for her beauty, wisdom, and regal presence, Elizabeth's image was everything. Her appearance became as much a part of her power as her politics. And yet, as immaculate as her public persona seemed, the reality of her personal hygiene was far from what one might expect from a queen of such stature. Beneath her painted face, carefully crafted garments, and the aura of divine purity, there lay a startling truth. Elizabeth's daily hygiene routine was far from the ideal cleanliness one might imagine for a monarch. As we explored earlier, the Queen's court was full of smells, not the sweet perfumes that one might associate with royalty, but the heavy, suffocating scent of unwashed bodies, stale clothing, and the ever-present perfume used to mask it all. Elizabeth's hygiene habits were a blend of superstition, social pressure, and an attempt to maintain her image as the untouchable Virgin Queen. And the most telling aspect of her daily routine was her fear of bathing. Bathing, for Elizabeth, was an act fraught with danger. It was not a practice to be taken lightly. She believed that immersing oneself in water could open pores and, in doing so, invite harmful diseases and infections. In an era where medicine was more superstition than science, it wasn't uncommon for people, even royalty, to fear the consequences of water on their skin. While many people would have seen a bath as an essential part of personal hygiene, Elizabeth saw it as a potential risk to her health. For her, it was a matter of survival, both physical and political. In place of bathing, Elizabeth turned to what she believed to be a safer alternative: perfume and powders. The heavy use of fragrances became not only an everyday necessity, but also a vital part of her persona. She used perfumes liberally, masking the natural scent of her body with sweet, floral notes that symbolized her purity and divinity. Her favorite perfumes were rich and strong, creating a barrier between her and the realities of bodily odors that might otherwise tarnish her royal image. Her clothing, too, was never washed. Instead, it was brushed and scented regularly to maintain the illusion of cleanliness. The gowns and layers of silk, velvet, and satin that Elizabeth wore were brushed by her servants to remove any dirt or dust that might have accumulated throughout the day. These garments, which were often decorated with jewels and intricate embroidery, were scented frequently with oils and perfumes. The oils served to mask any unpleasant odors, while the powders she used were designed to give her a fresh, youthful appearance. Elizabeth's clothes were meant to speak volumes, not just about her status, but about her purity, health, and power. Each layer of clothing was a carefully curated part of the spectacle of royalty, and every brush of perfume was a reminder of her untouchable status. However, her reliance on scent didn't stop at her clothes. Elizabeth's gloves were soaked in oils and perfumes. These gloves, which she wore almost constantly, were another part of her performance. The smell of perfume would linger on her hands, hiding the reality of sweat or dirt that might have been there. The gloves were not merely functional, they were symbolic of her position as queen. They served as a protective barrier between her skin and the outside world, In a sense, they were an extension of her power, keeping the unpleasant, the common, and the unsightly away from the regal form of the queen. Her handkerchiefs, too, were a critical part of her hygiene routine. Elizabeth carried these cloths with her at all times, often scented with fragrant oils. These handkerchiefs were used not just to wipe away any sweat or excess perfume, but also to mask the natural smells that might have accompanied her day-to-day activities. They were part of her efforts to maintain her public image and to protect her from the possibility of any odor seeping through the walls of her personal space. Her handkerchiefs, like her gloves and clothing, were soaked in the very essence of her royal performance, reflecting her belief that cleanliness was not just a physical necessity, but a social one. By carrying around these symbols of refinement and purity, she was able to maintain the appearance of perfect health and beauty, no matter what the reality might have been. In the absence of regular baths, Elizabeth's court developed a ritual of scenting and personal grooming that transcended simple hygiene. The act of scenting became a form of ritualistic performance, as much about politics as it was about cleanliness. It wasn't enough to simply smell good. Elizabeth's fragrance had to be perfect, controlled, and absolutely aligned with her public persona. Her daily routine was as much about preserving her royal image as it was about keeping herself physically presentable. The entire court followed suit, imitating Elizabeth's rituals of cleanliness. The courtiers, too, would apply perfumes and powders, brush their garments, and ensure that their scent reflected their status. The use of perfume was not just an aesthetic choice, it was a political one. By smelling like the queen, the courtiers affirmed their loyalty to her and their place in the royal hierarchy. The act of scenting wasn't just about avoiding unpleasant smells, it was about reaffirming one's position within the court and within society at large. Despite the elaborate rituals of scenting, however, there was always the underlying truth. The queen and her court were not clean in the way we understand cleanliness today. Bathing, washing, and general hygiene practices were not considered essential for good health in Elizabethan England. Instead, the court turned to the power of perfume, clothing, and ritualistic practices to maintain the illusion of purity. Elizabeth, with all her beauty, power, and political savvy, relied on this illusion to preserve her image as the untouchable, divine queen. But in the quiet moments, behind the carefully applied perfume and powdered wigs, the reality of Elizabeth's personal hygiene practices was far less glamorous. Her fear of water, combined with the belief that perfume and powders could ward off disease and keep her pure, resulted in a regime of cleanliness that was more about appearance than health. The result was a court that was filled with a constant scent of lavender, roses, and musk fragrances that were used to hide the natural odors of the human body, but also to reinforce the grandeur of the monarchy. It was an empire built on illusion, a world where cleanliness was not simply a practical matter, but a social, political, and spiritual performance. This reliance on scent to mask the truth of personal hygiene speaks volumes about the way that Elizabeth and those around her saw themselves. The queen's appearance was her armor, a shield against the threats of disease, aging, and commonness. The perfume, the powdered wigs, the elegant clothing, they were all part of a larger effort to present herself as something beyond the frailty of the human body, to embody a perfection that was impossible to attain. In the end, Elizabeth's hygiene habits were a product of the time she lived in, where image and public perception were paramount, and the realities of health and cleanliness were secondary concerns. It was a delicate balance, one that required constant maintenance and vigilance, but it was a balance that allowed Elizabeth to remain the powerful and iconic figure she was for so many years. Her daily hygiene rituals were more than just a reflection of her vanity. They were an essential part of her reign, a way to maintain control over her image and her power. The perfume, the gloves, the powders, they were not just about keeping up appearances. They were about creating an illusion that allowed her to continue to rule with authority, even as the truth of her physicality remained hidden beneath layers of scent and fabric. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the emblem of England's might, grace, and untouchable reign, was an extraordinary figure of history. Her public image was polished to perfection, a flawless representation of a powerful monarch. Yet, the deeper you delve into the world of her court, the more you realize that her image was, to a large extent, crafted. Elizabeth knew, perhaps better than anyone, the importance of presenting an image of masking imperfections, both personal and political, and this extended far beyond her clothes, her mannerisms, and her words. One of the most striking, albeit often overlooked, aspects of her image was the use of scent. In a time when health practices were rudimentary and cleanliness was more about performance than hygiene, Elizabeth's use of perfume was emblematic of her power, her status, and her careful navigation of court politics. The smell that enveloped her was not simply a pleasant fragrance, but an extension of her royal authority. It was a tool both personal and political that allowed her to maintain her position as the untouchable monarch. The scent of Elizabeth I became inseparable from her rule, woven into the very fabric of the Tudor court. As much as it was about vanity, perfume for Elizabeth was a signal, a symbol of her nobility, wealth, and absolute control. In an era where status was paramount, the scent one wore was as significant as the clothes they wore, the jewelry they adorned themselves with, or the titles they held. To walk into a room and be bathed in the scent of expensive perfume was to make a statement, not just about personal hygiene, but about one's place in the social hierarchy. Elizabeth's use of perfume was one of the ways she ensured that no one would forget who she was, the Virgin Queen, untouchable and powerful, a figure above the fray of everyday human concerns. The fragrance she wore was rich and potent. It was an olfactory extension of her presence, something that made her unforgettable. But it wasn't just about the personal pleasure of a lovely fragrance. No, Elizabeth used perfume as a tool, one of many she employed to reinforce her power. At a time when visual impressions were of the utmost importance, scent became just as political as her speeches or her attire. It allowed Elizabeth to mark her identity, to show her superiority, and to distance herself from the dirt and the smells of everyday life, which were often inescapable for the lower classes. Perfume acted as a barrier between her and the common world, a way to shield herself from the reality of the human body's natural odors. Within the grand walls of Elizabeth's court, perfume became a political tool, a method to assert control, and perhaps more importantly, to signal loyalty. It was a language of its own, where the choice of fragrance, or the absence of it, spoke volumes about one's rank and alliances. At Elizabeth's court, perfume wasn't just a personal indulgence, it was a way of survival. Those who wore the same fragrance as the Queen, or who could afford to use the same expensive scents, were signaling their loyalty and proximity to the Queen's power. On the other hand, those who wore lesser fragrances, or worse, no fragrance at all, were at risk of being seen as less important, less loyal, or even unworthy of being in the Queen's presence. Scent, in this sense, became both a privilege and a weapon. Perfume in Elizabeth's court wasn't just a tool of individual luxury, it was a cultural force, shaping the very social fabric of the court. The act of scenting oneself became ritualistic, a daily part of court life. To smell right was to belong. But more than that, it was to signal allegiance. Those who knew how to use perfume to their advantage gained favor in the eyes of the queen, for perfume became part of the very system of patronage and favoritism that defined the Tudor court. In a world where appearance was everything, scent became as important as any other physical trait. It marked the divide between the high-born and the low-born, the trusted and the untrustworthy, the noble and the common. But perfume didn't just serve the purpose of highlighting Elizabeth's royal image, it also functioned as a means of control. In a court full of intrigue, power struggles, and shifting allegiances, scent was a way of communicating without words. Elizabeth's use of perfume sent a clear message. She was in charge, her position was secure, and no one could encroach upon her. The fragrance she wore, and that others imitated, became her invisible crown, a marker of her supreme status. And those who could afford the same fragrances, whether they were allies, sycophants, or courtiers, were rewarded with her favor. The scent wasn't just a symbol of luxury, it was a mark of privilege, and by extension, a signal of political alliance. Elizabeth's perfume was, in essence, a carefully crafted piece of propaganda, helping to solidify her reign and her image as the Virgin Queen. Yet, as much as Elizabeth's fragrance served as a marker of power, it also revealed the delicate balance she had to maintain. The illusion of purity and cleanliness, created by the perfume, helped to reinforce her untouchable persona. But beneath that illusion was the reality of Elizabeth's personal hygiene, far less pristine than the Queen's image might suggest. Her court, while rich in scent and luxury, was also marked by the pervasive odor of sweat, unwashed fabrics, and the lingering stench of unbathed bodies. But by masking these smells with perfume, Elizabeth was able to maintain the illusion of immaculate purity, something that was crucial for her image as the Virgin Queen. The Queen's fragrance wasn't just for masking odors, it was for masking her humanity. Perfume, in this sense, became a bridge between the world of the Queen and the world of her courtiers. It created a shared experience where the scent of the Queen was something to be revered and imitated. The scent, more than just an aroma, became a symbol of the Queen's power, a way to demonstrate allegiance to her and to reinforce the hierarchy of the court. By using perfume, Elizabeth ensured that the experience of the court was not just a visual one, but also a sensory one. The court's fragrance became as much a part of the daily rituals as its dress and speech. It was a way to enter the Queen's world, to align oneself with her power, and to participate in the careful performance of court life. Elizabeth's use of perfume, while emblematic of her wealth and power, also reflected the fragile nature of the world she inhabited. Her reliance on fragrance to maintain her image as the untouchable monarch speaks to the importance of perception in her time. To remain powerful, Elizabeth needed to be seen as pristine, as divine, and as unreachable. Her perfume was a tool to ensure this image, a means to maintain the facade of purity and power. And for her courtiers, the act of mimicking her scent was a means of survival, a way to stay in her favor and to secure their place at the royal table. In the end, Elizabeth's fragrance was more than just a luxury. It was a symbol of her reign, her status, and her carefully constructed image as the Virgin Queen, untouchable and divine. In the royal court of Elizabethan England, cleanliness was not simply a matter of personal hygiene, but a performance, an elaborate display of wealth, status, and divine favor to be seen in the court, whether by the Queen herself or in the grand public assemblies, was to be surrounded by a certain air of perfection, where every noble's appearance was a meticulously curated testament to their exalted position. But beneath the shimmering facade of cleanliness, an entire class divide persisted. one where the reality of hygiene for the rich and poor couldn't have been more different. While the Queen and her court swirled in a cloud of perfumes and powders, the common folk, those in the lower rungs of society, were left to manage with far more rudimentary means. Elizabeth, like many of the aristocracy, used her appearance and smell as a social tool. Her lavish use of perfume wasn't merely for masking unpleasant odors. It was a marker of her superiority. The nobility could afford to indulge in such luxuries because they controlled wealth and power. But for the commoner, the lack of such resources became evident in the smell of their bodies, their clothes, and their homes. Elizabeth's court was enveloped in heavy layers of sweet-smelling perfume, which, along with other adornments, formed part of a ritual designed to ensure that the Queen's image was untarnished. The nobles had access to a wealth of perfumes, powders, and scented oils, and they used these products liberally to create an illusion of cleanliness, concealing the filth that would have otherwise been evident. Bathing, which was considered risky due to the prevailing belief that it could open the pores to disease, was replaced by a constant sprinkling of lavender, rosemary, and other expensive fragrances that masked the smell of sweat, grime, and body odor. To be in proximity to the Queen, to speak in her presence, to receive a nod of favor from the highest power in the land, this was not just about appearance. It was about projecting an image of health, purity, and superiority that was socially and politically important. Cleanliness was not merely an act of hygiene, but a symbol of control, wealth, and divine right. However, the luxury of such cleanliness was, of course, not shared equally. The commoners, those who worked tirelessly to keep the country running, had little access to these precious resources. Bathing was a rare occurrence for the poor, often seen as something dangerous, and when they did wash, it was a rudimentary, often uncomfortable affair. They didn't have the luxury of expensive perfumes and scented oils to mask the smell of their bodies, nor could they afford the fancy clothing that would shield them from the elements. Their homes, which lacked the luxury of a royal court, were far less refined, and, naturally, they smelled of sweat, earth, and the daily struggles of survival. Their bodies, too, were a reflection of their impoverished status. While the nobility could mask their natural body odors with expensive fragrances, the common folk were often exposed, their natural scent a clear marker of their lower social position. In a society so focused on outward appearances and class distinctions, body odor became a symbol of status. The wealthier one was, the more likely they were to be able to afford personal hygiene products to keep their body odor in check. To be clean, to smell good, was a direct indicator of one's status in the class hierarchy. The wealthy could afford to spend time and resources on their cleanliness, while the poor, by necessity, had to make do with what they could afford, leaving their smell a stark contrast to that of the court. This division in hygiene and personal care extended far beyond the physical. It reinforced the rigid class distinctions of the time, where wealth determined not only the ability to keep clean, but also the perception of personal worth and virtue. The nobility, adorned in their finery, could hide the evidence of their body's natural odors, thus projecting an image of purity and superiority. In contrast, the commoners, unable to mask their natural scent, were forced to live in a world where their smell, too, was a reflection of their status, often seen as inferior and dirty. Yet, it wasn't just the lack of resources that kept the lower classes from enjoying the same level of cleanliness as their wealthier counterparts. It was also the prevailing societal and medical beliefs. The idea that bathing was dangerous was common among both the elite and the lower classes, but for the rich, this belief didn't stop them from indulging in other forms of cleanliness. They could use perfumes and oils, knowing full well that these could mask any unpleasant smells and help maintain their public image. For the commoners, however, the fear of disease was compounded by the lack of access to resources. They were often relegated to using poor quality cleaning methods and could rarely afford what few resources were available. They didn't have the means to use oils and perfumes, and often their bodies became their defining characteristic, one that placed them firmly in the lower rungs of society. This imbalance in cleanliness between the rich and poor was an uncomfortable truth of Elizabethan England, one that reinforced the rigid class divisions. The wealthy could afford the illusion of cleanliness, while the poor had to make do with whatever they could afford, their natural sense becoming symbols of their poverty. The pressure to maintain a certain image, especially for those in the nobility, extended to every aspect of life, and the Queen herself, the embodiment of the nation's glory, was not exempt from this pressure. Her appearance, as meticulously curated as it was a performance that, in many ways, obscured the truth about the realities of hygiene for both the rich and the poor. The illusion of cleanliness in Elizabethan England was, in many ways, a mask, a carefully constructed facade that hid the grim realities of life for many. It served as a form of social control, where the wealthy could maintain their status through the appearance of purity, while the poor were forced to live with the realities of their physical condition. The body odors of the commoners were often seen as a sign of their inferiority, and their lack of access to the same resources as the elite reinforced the social divide. In a world where appearance was everything, cleanliness became a weapon of power, a way to reinforce class boundaries and keep the lower classes in their place. But while the nobility's access to hygiene and fragrance represented their power and control, it also highlighted the extreme disparities that existed within society. Cleanliness became a mark of status, not just of wealth, but of virtue, moral worth, and spiritual purity. Those who could afford to indulge in the luxury of cleanliness were seen as virtuous, while those who could not were stigmatized as dirty or unworthy. The divide between the rich and poor was made manifest through the sense and symbol of cleanliness, perpetuating a social system that reinforced the existing power structures. Cleanliness was a performance, and in this performance, the poor were never the star. Instead, they were forced to live in the background, their bodies marked by their poverty, their smell a constant reminder of their place in the societal hierarchy. The wealthy, on the other hand, could use their access to perfumes and oils to obscure any signs of their physicality and maintain their status, keeping the illusion of purity intact. The social dynamics of the Elizabethan era were intrinsically tied to perceptions of cleanliness, or rather, the absence of it. As we delve further into the realities of hygiene and scent in Elizabeth's court, it's important to understand the divide between the nobility's carefully constructed cleanliness and the grimy reality faced by common folk. Elizabeth I's court, built on a foundation of performance and symbolism, placed great importance on appearance and ritual, especially when it came to bodily cleanliness. Yet, behind the heavily scented perfume, the grand gowns, and the ornate wigs lay an undeniable truth about the state of personal hygiene in her time. The wealthy, particularly in the upper echelons of Elizabethan society, were obsessed with appearance, using perfumes as a tool to mask the natural odors of the body. The very act of using scent became an extension of their power, wealth, and social status. Perfume was not just a commodity, but a marker of class, reinforcing their elevated place in society. For the rich, personal hygiene wasn't about cleanliness, it was about performance. The elaborate process of scenting oneself with luxurious fragrances served a dual purpose. It was both a shield to cover natural body odor and a symbol of status and refinement. Those with means could afford to mask their bodily sense, ensuring that they maintained an appearance of pristine, untouched beauty. The powerful smell of perfume became their invisible armor, keeping them aloof from the everyday struggles that plagued the lower classes. In contrast, for the common folk, cleanliness was a luxury they couldn't afford. They lived in a world where basic hygiene was often a struggle, if not entirely neglected. They couldn't afford the fragrant oils, herbs, and powders used by the aristocracy, and thus had to make do with what little resources they had. Bathing was not an everyday occurrence, and when they did bathe, it was in communal spaces where the water was shared. Soap was a rarity, and many relied on herbal concoctions or scented herbs like lavender or rosemary, which they would rub into their clothes or skin to attempt to mask the odors of sweat and dirt. These rudimentary cleaning methods were a far cry from the opulent rituals of the nobility. Yet for the commoners, they were often the only means of combating body odor and maintaining some semblance of cleanliness. The stark difference in access to cleanliness became a point of social stratification. The wealthier you were, the easier it was to maintain an illusion of cleanliness. And for the commoners, the natural odors of their unwashed bodies became a mark of their class. Body odor, to them, was not just a physical byproduct of life, but a visible marker of their place in society. Those who had the means to use perfume and powders were able to hide the reality of their natural smells. But for the commoners, the smell of the body was a constant, inescapable truth. It was not just a sign of poverty, but also of a lack of access to the societal rituals of cleanliness that were restricted to the wealthy. The nobility, however, took this idea a step further. In a world where public image was everything, body odor became something that could either elevate or diminish one's status. Perfume was not merely a tool for personal fragrance, it was an extension of one's identity. For the court, the idea of masking natural body odor was tied directly to their sense of self-worth and societal standing. A clean body, covered in the scent of lavender, rose, or musk, was a sign of civilization, refinement, and class. For the commoners, their lack of access to such luxuries meant that their body odors marked them as inferior, as untouchable in the eyes of the upper class. This divide between the clean, perfume-scented world of the rich and the natural, often pungent reality of the poor was indicative of the profound class divide that permeated Elizabethan society. In the realm of religion and social belief, cleanliness had its own set of moral and spiritual implications. For the nobility, cleanliness was often viewed as a reflection of their inner virtue, purity, and divine favor. The use of perfume and the maintenance of an immaculate appearance were not just seen as a matter of aesthetic preference, but as a reflection of one's moral standing. In a society where divine right ruled and outward appearance was a sign of inner grace, keeping the body clean by covering it in rich, intoxicating perfumes was viewed as a divine act of self-presentation. The nobility's cleanliness was almost a sacrament, a form of devotion not just to themselves, but to God and their subjects. For commoners, however, the lack of cleanliness is often tied to a perceived moral failing. The poor were frequently subjected to judgment for their inability to keep up with the noble standards of hygiene. The presence of body odor, dirt, and grime was seen as evidence of their inferior status, both socially and morally. They were believed to be closer to nature, their unwashed bodies a symbol of their base, lower position in the social order. In a society where appearances could dictate one's worth, the lack of perfume, clean clothing, or proper bathing could lead to shame, isolation, and judgment. This belief in the importance of cleanliness was reinforced by the prevailing religious and social beliefs of the time. The concept of purity was deeply tied to the religious practices of the era. Purity of body, mind, and spirit was an essential component of living a righteous life. The use of perfume and the avoidance of body odor were symbolic of one's closeness to divine favor, while the common people, in their unwashed state, were seen as further removed from God's grace. This created a deep, unspoken divide between the two classes, with cleanliness acting as a reflection of social, moral, and spiritual worth. As we reflect on the stark contrast between the nobility's obsession with masking body odors and the harsh reality faced by the commoners, it's easy to see how hygiene became more than just a physical matter. It became an ideological battleground, a symbol of class and power. The wealthy could afford to hide the truth of their bodies behind layers of perfume, while the poor had no choice but to wear their smell as a badge of their station. The ritual of scent, as practiced by the nobility, became a performance of power, a way to solidify their place at the top of the social ladder, while for the common folk, their inability to perform such rituals marked them as less than, reminding them of their societal place. Cleanliness in Elizabethan England wasn't merely a matter of hygiene. It was a reflection of power, status, and morality. For the nobility, perfume and cleanliness were vital tools for maintaining their social position, masking not only bodily odors but also the very realities of life. For the commoners, the inability to mask their scent became a stark reminder of their poverty and place in the hierarchy. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was not just a personal matter, it was a social and political statement, shaping the lives of Elizabethans from the court to the village. The illusion of cleanliness in Elizabeth's court, paired with the grim reality for the commoners, serves as a vivid reminder of the role that scent, status, and social norms played in shaping the lives of those in the 16th century. As the Queen of England, Elizabeth I carried with her a carefully crafted image that was not only a reflection of her power, but also a tool for political survival. Her court was filled with layers of pageantry, from the magnificence of her clothing to the grandeur of her palace, all designed to convey strength, authority, and invincibility. But as much as her outward appearance commanded respect, it was the perfume she wore that became one of the most powerful symbols of her reign. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a ritual, a performance, and a mask that allowed Elizabeth to conceal her vulnerabilities from the world. The act of applying perfume was not simply about fragrance, it was integral to the persona she cultivated. Each day before stepping into the public eye or into her court, Elizabeth would lavish herself in the sweet, overpowering scent of perfumes. The delicate glass bottles filled with exotic oils and essences were a tool for her image, an image that demanded perfection, youth, and strength. To the people who witnessed her, Elizabeth was not just a queen, she was an icon, an embodiment of the power of England itself, and so her appearance, her scent, became part of that iconic image. As she prepared for the day's duties, Elizabeth would first take the time to carefully select her perfumes. They weren't merely chosen for their pleasant aroma, but for their ability to mask the unpleasant signs of aging and deteriorating health that she worked so hard to conceal. The Queen's declining health, which had begun to take its toll as the years wore on, was kept hidden behind layers of scent and powder. Elizabeth had grown into a woman whose body had seen the passage of time. Her skin was no longer the smooth, youthful visage of her younger years, and the bright eyes of her youth had become clouded with illness and fatigue. But perfume, with its sweet and heady fragrance, allowed her to obscure these signs. Perfume served as more than just a cosmetic cover, it was a veil that concealed the Queen's vulnerabilities. Elizabeth was not simply hiding the physical signs of aging, but the very realities of her human frailty. The power of fragrance became a shield that allowed her to maintain her position as the immortal Virgin Queen, untouched by time or mortality. She used perfume in a ritualistic manner, applying it liberally and regularly to ensure that her presence would always carry the aura of youth and vitality. The more perfume she wore, the less the court would notice her weariness, her deteriorating body, and her increasingly frail condition. For Elizabeth, fragrance wasn't just a tool of vanity, it was an essential part of the political armor she had to wear every day. As the Queen, she was not only the ruler of England, but also the symbol of its strength, its purity, and its divine right to rule. Any sign of weakness or decay, whether physical or emotional, could be perceived as a threat to her reign. Therefore, the ritual of perfume application became deeply symbolic. It was a way for Elizabeth to maintain the illusion of invincibility, to assert her power, and to remain an untouchable figure in the eyes of the public. In the delicate dance of courtly life, where every gesture, every word, and every appearance was scrutinized for signs of vulnerability, Elizabeth's use of perfume became a political tool of immense significance. It helped her navigate the complex landscape of Elizabethan society, where personal weakness could be fatal to one's status. For a queen whose rule was constantly challenged by political intrigue, courtly rivalry, and threats to her throne, maintaining an air of invulnerability was crucial. Her perfume wasn't just about scent, it was a deliberate performance that communicated strength, control, and composure. Perfume, for Elizabeth, was more than a fragrant luxury. It was a strategic element in maintaining the image of a powerful and untouchable ruler. She used it not just to cover physical discomfort, but to transform her image into one of purity and power. When Elizabeth entered a room, it wasn't just her appearance that commanded attention. It was the fragrance that lingered in the air, the subtle but powerful reminder of her status and authority. The scent of her perfumes was intoxicating, drawing people in and reinforcing the notion that she was more than just a mortal queen. But behind the fragrant facade, Elizabeth was also hiding the inevitable truth: her health was failing. The strain of ruling, the stress of her position, and the passage of time had left their mark. Her body, once youthful and strong, was now deteriorating, and the demands of leadership took a toll on her physical well-being. But perfume, as much as it masked her fragility, also served as a symbol of her resilience. It represented her refusal to let her personal weaknesses show, to allow her health to interfere with the image of regal perfection she had cultivated over the years. To the courtiers who surrounded her, Elizabeth's scent was a signal of loyalty and respect. It wasn't just that they imitated her perfumes, it was that they understood the importance of maintaining that royal image. Just as Elizabeth used perfume to mask her vulnerabilities, so did her courtiers, in their own way, use it to align themselves with her power. The court was a place where every individual was trying to secure their place in the intricate web of royal favor, and one way to do so was by emulating the queen's image. The mimicking of her scent, her mannerisms, and her speech was not just a sign of devotion, it was a form of political survival. As the years went by and Elizabeth's health continued to decline, the perfume she wore became a symbol not only of her strength, but also of her struggle. Her body may have been succumbing to time, but her image, her carefully constructed image, remained intact, shielded by layers of scent, powder, and carefully applied cosmetics. And in the court of England, where appearances were everything, this was all that mattered. The Queen's scent, her regal presence, and her unmistakable aura of invincibility were essential to her political survival. But beneath all the layers of fragrance, There were signs of the Queen's real battle, the battle to maintain an image of strength when her body was beginning to betray her. The perfume ritual was not only a performance for her court, but also a personal shield. It allowed Elizabeth to continue her reign and maintain the authority that came with it, even as her physical health faltered. The perfume helped her retain the power to rule, both in the eyes of the people and in her own mind. For Elizabeth, the use of perfume was far more than a luxury. It was a vital part of the mask she wore, one that allowed her to keep the kingdom's respect and her sense of self intact. It was a constant reminder that, in the world of Elizabeth I, image was everything. As the years passed, the once vibrant queen began to show signs of the passage of time. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, had built her reign on an image of invincibility, youth, and grace. Her power was not just political, it was embodied in every carefully crafted appearance, every speech, every move she made. The image of Elizabeth was as much a symbol of the English crown as the crown itself. She represented strength, wisdom, and eternal youth, a woman who had faced the turmoil of her time and emerged victorious, unscathed by age, her mind sharp, her body enduring. But beneath this idealized image, Elizabeth's health was slowly and steadily deteriorating. While the Queen presented herself as a radiant, untouchable figure, the truth was that her body was struggling under the weight of time, neglect, and the harsh demands of her reign. She had long relied on the elaborate rituals of makeup, wigs, and perfumes to maintain the appearance of youthful beauty. However, this was an illusion. The more she relied on these artifices, the more she hid the toll her body was enduring. Elizabeth's beauty regimen was notoriously extreme. She used heavy layers of makeup, primarily composed of lead-based white powders and mercury-laden rouge, to keep her skin pale and youthful. But this toxic combination had serious consequences. Over time, these cosmetics caused the Queen's skin to break out in sores and become damaged. The skin that once gleamed with health now showed signs of wear. But these blemishes were hidden under layers of white powder. The heavy makeup, along with the perfumes she wore to mask the smell of her body and the constant strain of ruling, contributed to a life spent in a constant battle against the ravages of time. But the public never saw the toll. Elizabeth's reliance on these beauty products allowed her to maintain the image of eternal youth. In public, she was still the graceful, powerful queen who commanded the attention and reverence of her people. Her portraits continued to reflect this idealized version of herself, youthful, elegant, untouchable. The public didn't see the reality of her deteriorating health, nor could they know the true cost of her beauty. The myth of eternal youth was vital to the Queen's image. She had worked tirelessly to craft and maintain this persona, and she couldn't let anything, not even her own body, undermine it. The toll on her body, however, was undeniable. Her teeth, for example, had rotted away due to her excessive consumption of sugar, a luxury item of the time. Elizabeth's smile, once radiant, had become increasingly absent from her public appearances. Her mouth closed tightly to conceal the decay. Her breath, heavy with the smell of her decaying teeth, was carefully hidden behind perfume-soaked handkerchiefs and gloves. Despite this, her public appearances continued to radiate vitality. Her once tumultuous red hair, the symbol of her youthful energy, began to thin and gray, though she continued to wear her elaborate wigs. The wigs, often powdered and perfumed, served to mask the inevitable aging of her own hair. The Queen, who had spent so many years in the public eye, knew that any sign of imperfection could spell disaster. She couldn't afford to show the world that she was anything less than perfect. So she hid her physical decline behind layers of makeup, perfume, and the grandeur of her royal attire. Elizabeth's public image was so vital to her that she concealed the reality of her physical suffering. While her body struggled, her mind remained sharp, and her spirit unwavering. She understood that as long as her image remained intact, so would her power. Her reign had been defined by her ability to project strength, and that strength had been projected through her public appearances, not her physical well-being. Her image was her armor, and she wore it religiously. But beneath the facade, Elizabeth was growing frail. Her joints ached, her energy waned, and her appearance began to reflect the wear and tear of her life. She had lived through the trials of her youth, the battles of her reign, and the emotional turmoil of her personal life. But now the physical toll was taking its toll. Her aging body seemed like the one enemy she could not defeat. But she refused to let her people see this. The Queen's decline was a guarded secret, one that only a few trusted confidants knew. Her courtiers, who had long admired her strength and vitality, began to see her in a new light. But they too were sworn to maintain the illusion. They continued to flatter her, to encourage the image she had so carefully constructed. And Elizabeth herself was more than willing to play her part. She had been the Virgin Queen for decades, a symbol of purity and invincibility. And now she had to fight even harder to preserve that image, even as her body began to show signs of wear. In her final years, Elizabeth's health deteriorated more rapidly, but she continued to perform her role. The Queen, who had once led England through turbulent times, now found herself struggling with the most human of frailties. The illness that plagued her was hidden behind layers of paint and perfume, and her court continued to bask in the illusion of her invulnerability. The image of Elizabeth was so intertwined with her identity as a ruler that it became more important than her personal health. Her personal life had been a series of performances: her virginity, her beauty, her rule, and she had made a career out of controlling the narrative of her reign. Now, in her final years, Elizabeth continued to control the narrative of her health. She knew that as long as she appeared strong, she would remain powerful. But as her body continued to break down, it became clear that even the most carefully constructed image could not keep the truth at bay forever. The myth of Elizabeth's eternal youth and beauty had served her well for many years. It had helped her solidify her power, maintain her position as the Queen of England, and secure her place in history. But in the end, even the most carefully maintained image could not hide the reality of her decline. Her health was a silent battle she fought in private, while the public saw only what she allowed them to see. Elizabeth's ability to maintain her public image, despite her physical decline, speaks to the power of performance in politics and leadership. She showed the world that in a monarchy where appearances were everything, the ability to project strength and invulnerability could be just as important as actual strength. But her health, in the end, was a stark reminder that even the greatest monarchs are vulnerable to the ravages of time. Despite the performance, despite the masks she wore, Elizabeth I was not immune to the inevitable decline of age. Yet, she had given the world an image of a queen who could endure anything, and in that, she remained, in some ways, immortal. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, a figure celebrated not only for her political acumen and power, but also for her majestic and seemingly timeless beauty, was a monarch whose appearance held immense significance in her court. Her image was more than just a reflection of personal care. It was a symbol of her strength, control, and the very fabric of her reign. However, behind the royal exterior, some practices and rituals influenced not just her image but also those of the courtiers who surrounded her. Elizabeth's approach to cleanliness was not simply a personal choice. It was an intricate part of her power, and it seeped into the very culture of the court, creating a shared sense of appearance and, in many ways, loyalty. It is said that Queen Elizabeth's public appearance was almost as powerful as her political decisions. Her extravagant use of perfumes, powders, and elaborate clothing was not just about looking pristine, it was about maintaining an image that reflected her authority. Her courtiers, naturally, followed suit. They mimicked her rituals of cleanliness and appearance, adopting the use of perfumes and scented powders to maintain their own perceived purity. These fragrances, sometimes heavily scented and often mixed with floral and herbal notes, were not merely cosmetic. They became a statement of their position at court, a marker of their proximity to the Queen's favor. To be at court meant adhering to these unspoken rules of appearance. The courtiers who followed the Queen's lead wore their own carefully applied scents as a form of armor. It wasn't just about personal hygiene. It was a practice tied to their standing in the political landscape of Elizabethan England. Fragrance, in this sense, became an extension of loyalty. The scents they wore signaled allegiance to the Queen. Each spritz of perfume, a subtle, scented gesture of support. But perfume wasn't just about smelling good, it became a political tool in its own right. The scent of a courtier had meaning, especially in a world where appearance was a tool of political survival. In the competitive, often cutthroat environment of Elizabeth's court, personal scent could make or break one's reputation. A well-scented courtier, close to the Queen and her personal rituals, signaled more than just good taste. It suggested loyalty, favor, and proximity to the Queen's inner circle. Those who could afford the finest oils and fragrances, sometimes imported from far-off lands, were able to further cement their status within the Queen's court. For the courtiers who didn't have access to such luxury, the scent of cheap perfume or the absence of it could spell social death, a sign of neglect, or a lack of influence. Elizabeth, as the monarch, understood the power of appearance, and in many ways, she wielded this power through the very rituals of cleanliness and scent. The Queen's own fragrant aura became a manifestation of her reign, a symbol of authority that permeated through the court, from the highest noble to the lowest servant. But this wasn't only about outward appearance. The emphasis on fragrance was rooted in Elizabeth's strategy of managing not only her image, but her court's perception of her power. It was through these scents, the social ritual of cleanliness, and the politics of appearances that Elizabeth maintained control over her subjects, ensuring that her power remained undisputed. Elizabeth's carefully curated image of cleanliness, then, wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was an embodiment of her ability to control not only her personal life, but the narrative around her reign. In a time when women were often judged by their beauty and purity, Elizabeth's immaculate image sent a message that her personal identity and authority were intertwined. To be seen as clean, powerful, and beyond reproach was to assert control over her court, her kingdom, and her legacy. But while outward appearance was essential, it also had deeper political implications. It allowed her to maintain an untouchable status in the eyes of the public, masking vulnerabilities, physical and personal, that might otherwise have been seen as weaknesses. The royal emphasis on cleanliness was also a tool for creating division between the nobility and commoners. While the Queen's court followed these rituals, commoners, who did not have access to such resources, were often less concerned with the outward appearance of cleanliness. In the Queen's court, however, every action, every gesture, even the scent of one's skin was measured, scrutinized, and marked as part of the larger theater of power. It's in this way that Elizabeth, with her focus on appearance, leveraged one of the most potent symbols of her reign: control over not only her body, but also the narrative that shaped her monarchy. As much as it was about social order, the scent of the Queen, and by extension her courtiers, had a deeper, more symbolic meaning. It wasn't just a tool of survival or status, it was a statement of strength and resilience. In the midst of political upheaval, religious divides, and a constantly shifting landscape, Elizabeth's fragrance became a marker of consistency. It was the scent of victory, power, and a regal authority that would continue long after her death. And this symbolic power wasn't just an internal thing, it was woven into the very fabric of the court's day-to-day life. The perfumed court existed in a world where power, politics, and performance intersected, and it was through the Queen's own image and the rituals she fostered that these forces played out in full. But beyond the perfume bottles, the powders, and the lotions lay the deeper truth. Elizabeth's control over her image was integral to her survival as a monarch in an unforgiving world. And her courtiers? They too knew that to rise in the ranks, they needed to partake in this scented performance, in a world where every gesture, every appearance was scrutinized. Her court, a world of fragrances, whispers, and political games, was a reflection of her personal strategy of survival, one that hinged not just on military might or diplomacy, but on her ability to control perception, to stay untouchable, and to wield power even through scent. The Queen's relationship with perfumes and the courtiers who followed her example was intricately linked to her image of purity, wealth, and control. For Elizabeth, this wasn't just about smelling good, it was about reinforcing her legitimacy, holding on to her power, and surviving in a world that demanded perfection, where every scent had a story, a meaning, and a purpose in her grand royal game. As the Queen's personal ritual of applying perfumes became as much a part of her reign as her political tactics, it served as a subtle reminder that in the world of Elizabethan England, the scent of power was something that lingered long after she passed from the throne. The fragrance of royalty, loyalty, and the politics of smell became not just a story of cleanliness, but of a monarch who used every tool at her disposal to maintain her status through the artistry of appearance and the powerful, unseen symbolism of scent. And so, in this world of perfumes, powders, and politics, Elizabeth I ruled her legacy as eternal as the fragrance she left behind. As Queen Elizabeth I's reign passed into history, her legacy continued to resonate long after her death, while her political acumen, military victories, and religious reforms shaped the future of England. Her meticulous attention to her personal image, the way she managed her appearance, her hygiene, and her overall health had a profound and lasting effect on the monarchy and royal culture for centuries to come. Her approach to cleanliness and image management wasn't just about vanity. It was a deliberate and strategic choice that reflected her understanding of power and the political importance of perception. Elizabeth was acutely aware of the significance of her image in maintaining authority. As a female monarch ruling in a patriarchal society, her public persona had to be flawless, untouchable, and symbolically perfect. Her hygiene habits, though unconventional and often damaging to her health, were part of a broader strategy to maintain control over the narrative surrounding her reign. This intense focus on outward appearance and cleanliness set the stage for future monarchs who would follow her lead in presenting a controlled and curated image to the world. Elizabeth's reign changed the way monarchy was perceived and practiced. She was not just a ruler, she was an image. Her reign was the birth of the performance-based approach to royalty. In her court, how one presented themselves mattered almost as much as their deeds. This was particularly important for Elizabeth, who had to work doubly hard to prove her legitimacy as a woman on the throne. She couldn't afford to show weakness, and as such, every detail of her personal care, from her clothing to her hygiene, was carefully curated to project strength and unassailable power. Her successors, especially the Stuart monarchs, inherited this understanding of the monarchy as a performance. King James I, though different in character, also had to maintain an image of power and divine right, one that required careful attention to appearance. He followed the blueprint Elizabeth had laid out, though he was less concerned with her stringent beauty rituals. But it was her influence that set the standard for all future English monarchs. They would not only rule with authority, but also with an awareness of the power of their image. This performance-based approach was particularly evident during the reigns of later monarchs like Charles I and Charles II, who, like Elizabeth, understood the impact of their appearance on their political standing. Charles II's famous personal style and grooming, for instance, owed much to the precedent set by Elizabeth. It wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about creating an aura of royalty that could not be questioned. Even today, the idea of the royal family as a performance persists. Monarchs like Queen Elizabeth II, though a more modern and subdued figure, still adhered to a carefully managed image. The royal family's clothing, demeanor, and public appearances are all part of a carefully curated narrative that was first established by Elizabeth I. In this way, Elizabeth's approach to monarchy, where her image was as important as her actions, has left an indelible mark on the institution. Elizabeth's reign was also pivotal in cementing the role of perfume and appearance in the politics of monarchy. In her court, scent wasn't just a cosmetic tool, but a powerful political symbol. Perfume became an essential part of her royal persona, a way to mask imperfections, conceal vulnerabilities, and project an aura of wealth, purity, and divine favor. Elizabeth used perfume not just to cover body odors, but to signal her royal status, her wealth, and her authority. It was a tool of self-presentation that became deeply ingrained in the royal culture of Europe. The cultural legacy of perfume and appearance continued long after Elizabeth's death. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the use of fragrances, powders, and elaborate cosmetics became not just fashionable, but a symbol of high status and power. For the nobility, scent and appearance were inextricably linked to their identity and their place within society. Perfume was expensive, a luxury only the wealthy could afford. In a world where external appearance could influence political power and social standing, scent was as important as clothing and speech. In France, for example, Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, took Elizabeth's approach to appearance to new heights, with extravagant clothing, wigs, and perfumes symbolizing his royal power. Similarly, perfume was deeply integrated into the court culture of Versailles, where it was used to mask not just body odors, but the often insidious smells of courtly intrigue and political tension. The notion that scent was not just about cleanliness, but about power and status, became a hallmark of royal courts across Europe, tracing its roots back to Elizabeth's own carefully crafted image. Even in modern times, the importance of image and fragrance in the royal family persists. Queen Elizabeth II, though known for her more reserved public persona, still understands the symbolic weight of her appearance. The royal family, through their uniforms, clothing choices, and public appearances, maintains an image that harks back to Elizabeth I's understanding of royal presentation. Perfume and appearance are not just matters of aesthetics, they are matters of state. Elizabeth I's hygiene habits, with all their scandal and complexity, continue to captivate historians, biographers, and the public today. For all the grand historical events of her reign, it is fascinating how her personal habits, particularly those surrounding cleanliness and appearance, have become part of the story of her rule. Today, her use of toxic cosmetics, her avoidance of bathing, and her elaborate makeup rituals are subjects of fascination and horror in equal measure. In modern times, her hygiene practices stand in stark contrast to today's expectations of cleanliness, but they offer a glimpse into the realities of the time. Elizabeth's decisions around hygiene were not just personal quirks, they were deeply tied to her political survival. She knew that her image, her health, and the way she was perceived were directly linked to her power as a monarch. The fact that she was able to maintain her status despite her declining health and unorthodox hygiene practices speaks to her immense political skill and understanding of the role image played in her reign. Her hygiene habits are also a reflection of the broader societal and cultural norms of the time. Elizabeth was not the only monarch to struggle with maintaining her appearance, but she was the most successful at turning it into a political tool. Her legacy shows us how the pursuit of perfection in one's public image, no matter the cost, can be a powerful tool for political survival. Even in her physical decline, Elizabeth understood that the image of strength and vitality was what mattered most. In the modern world, Elizabeth's hygiene practices are a curious and fascinating part of her legacy. They offer a window into the complexities of the relationship between image, health, and power. Her story reminds us that in a world where appearance and perception often shape reality, the struggle to maintain one's image is not just a personal matter, but a matter of survival. Elizabeth's focus on her appearance has, over time, become one of the most enduring aspects of her reign. The legacy of her obsession with beauty, hygiene, and the power of appearance has been passed down through history, influencing the monarchy and broader society in ways that continue to this day. Even though the practices may seem outlandish by today's standards, they were an integral part of Elizabeth's political identity and her ability to hold power in a male-dominated world. Her hygiene habits, in all their complexity, serve as a testament to her resilience, her resourcefulness, and her unyielding desire to control the narrative of her reign. As we look back on the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, we not only see a monarch who shaped the course of history, but also a woman who understood the power of perception and the importance of image. Her hygiene practices, scandalous though they may seem today, were part of a larger story of political survival, cultural norms, and the complex relationship between beauty, power, and health. Today, Elizabeth's legacy endures not just through her political achievements, but through the lessons she imparted about the art of image management, lessons that continue to influence modern leaders and figures of power. As we delve deeper into the complexities of Queen Elizabeth I's reign, it becomes clear that her image, particularly her hygiene habits, has fascinated historians and the public for centuries. Today, the allure of her life is not just about the political genius or the religious upheaval that marked her reign. It is about the startling contrast between her personal care and our modern understanding of health and hygiene. In the 21st century, we look at her approach to beauty and cleanliness with a mixture of amazement, fascination, and for some, a hint of disgust. The stark differences between Elizabethan and contemporary hygiene practices reveal how far we have come in our understanding of personal care, health, and beauty standards. Queen Elizabeth I is remembered not only for her reign over England, but also for the mythology that surrounds her. Her appearance, maintained with great care, was a key component of her power, as was her carefully constructed public image. But behind the beauty, the lavish gowns, the jewelry, and the makeup, there was a much darker side to her hygiene practices. Modern historians have long been captivated by the paradox of Elizabeth's pristine exterior, contrasted with the unflattering truth of her personal habits. Elizabeth's hygienic routine, or lack thereof, has become a source of both horror and intrigue. As historians and biographers sift through records, letters, and portraits from the Elizabethan era. They begin to paint a picture of a queen who was meticulous about her image, but indifferent, if not fearful, of maintaining personal cleanliness. She is remembered for her white lead face paint, her avoidance of bathing, and her use of perfume to mask the pervasive odors of her body and the crowded palace. To modern sensibilities, this sounds shocking and even repellent. The thought of using toxic substances to maintain an outward appearance of health, or the avoidance of regular bathing for fear of illness, seems alien to us today. And yet, in Elizabeth's time, this was not only common practice, it was also a necessary ritual, deeply ingrained in the culture of the period. The fascination with Elizabeth's hygiene is not confined to scholars. It extends to popular culture, where she is often portrayed as both a glamorous and tragic figure. The idea that the Queen of England, the very symbol of power and authority, could fall prey to such primitive and dangerous beauty practices is endlessly fascinating. Modern readers and viewers are drawn to this contradiction, how someone so influential, so seemingly untouchable, could be bound by the very flaws of her time, particularly when it came to something as personal as hygiene. The enduring fascination with Elizabeth's hygiene, especially her use of cosmetics and perfumes to maintain her image, reveals the extent to which beauty rituals are tied to social status and political power. What would be seen today as harmful or antiquated, such as the use of toxic makeup or the avoidance of bathing, was in Elizabeth's era a vital tool for securing her place in history. When we compare Elizabeth's beauty regimen with modern standards, the contrast is stark. In today's world, personal hygiene is considered essential for health, self-esteem, and overall well-being. The focus on cleanliness has led to the widespread availability of personal hygiene products, soap, toothpaste, deodorant, and so much more that ensure people can maintain good health and hygiene daily. Modern beauty standards, while still highly influenced by appearance, are increasingly focused on health, sustainability, and personal comfort. The emphasis is not just on looking good, but on feeling good and taking care of one's body. Elizabeth's approach to beauty, however, was anything but about health. She used cosmetics made with lead, mercury, and other harmful chemicals that would cause severe damage to her skin over time. Her avoidance of regular bathing was based on the belief that water opened the pores to disease, a misconception that plagued many during her reign. Bathing, if done at all, was often seen as dangerous, so perfumes and powders were used to mask odors. What we now know about hygiene and skincare, how essential regular cleaning, moisturizing, and proper health practices are, is a world away from the methods that Elizabeth relied on. Modern beauty standards also emphasize transparency and self-care. There is a growing awareness of the dangers of harsh chemicals in cosmetics and a push toward natural beauty products that prioritize skin health over aesthetics. This shift reflects a growing understanding of the importance of taking care of the body from the inside out, something that was utterly foreign to Elizabethan beauty practices. Her focus on appearance was not about health or well-being, it was about maintaining an image, a power that could be manipulated and used to her advantage in a world where perception often defined one's worth. In contrast to Elizabeth's era, where beauty was a means of controlling perception, today's beauty standards are more inclusive and diverse, recognizing the importance of self-care and the celebration of natural beauty. While Elizabeth's reign was about controlling her image in the face of her physical decline, modern standards emphasize the well-being of the body as a whole, aiming for beauty that comes from within. The story of Elizabeth's hygiene is not just a relic of the past. It also marks the evolution of beauty rituals through history. The practices that Elizabeth adopted, although unhealthy, paved the way for the future of beauty in Western culture. Her reign, with its emphasis on appearance and symbolic cleanliness, had a profound influence on how royalty and the wealthy continued to use appearance as a political tool for centuries to come. In fact, beauty rituals became inextricably linked with social status and power for both men and women. Following Elizabeth's example, future monarchs, especially those in France, continued to use appearance as a critical part of their royal performance. Louis XIV of France, known as the Sun King, became famous not just for his political rule but for his obsession with his personal appearance, his extravagant fashion choices, and his courtly rituals of grooming. The cultural emphasis on outward beauty as a form of status continued throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, with monarchs and aristocrats seeking to maintain a divine, almost untouchable appearance. But as time passed, the definition of beauty and cleanliness began to shift. The advent of the scientific revolution and the subsequent advancements in hygiene and medicine gradually changed public perceptions of health and appearance. The rise of hygiene-focused beauty standards began in the 19th century, leading to a shift away from harmful cosmetics and towards healthier practices. The Victorians, with their emphasis on moral purity and cleanliness, helped to popularize the idea that beauty and hygiene were closely tied to virtue and good health. Today, the legacy of Elizabeth's beauty rituals can be seen not in the toxic chemicals she used, but in the continued importance placed on image in public life. While we no longer use lead-based makeup or avoid bathing for fear of disease, the obsession with appearance and the idea that beauty equals power are still prevalent in modern culture. Elizabeth's legacy endures not through her unhealthy beauty practices, but through the idea that controlling one's image can control one's destiny. Even in today's social media age, appearance is still often linked to success, influence, and power. Elizabeth's reign set a precedent for using beauty as a tool to manage one's public persona, and it remains a part of modern political and social strategy. Whether it's the polished look of politicians, celebrities, or influencers, the power of appearance remains strong. The evolution of beauty rituals, from Elizabeth's toxic beauty regimen to today's focus on skin, health, and natural beauty, highlights how far we've come in understanding the balance between health and image. The fascination with Queen Elizabeth I's hygiene habits will likely continue for years to come, as they reflect the complexity of power, image, and health. Despite the passage of time, the mystique surrounding her personal habits persists, shedding light on how deeply the concerns of beauty, cleanliness, and perception shaped the course of history. Elizabeth's hygiene practices were not just a personal issue, they were political. They reflected the anxieties of her time, the need for control, and the constant pressure of maintaining a public image that would serve her and her reign. Today, her image remains a symbol of political savvy, but also a reminder of how the maintenance of power can sometimes come at a great personal cost. As we look back on Elizabeth's reign, we see not just a monarch who wielded power with grace and intelligence, but a woman who understood the power of image and how to manipulate it for survival. Her legacy lives on, not only in her political achievements, but in the lessons she imparted about the art of self-presentation, lessons that continue to influence the way we view power, beauty, and the pursuit of perfection. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was a woman whose life was defined not only by her political genius, but by her ability to craft and maintain an image of power and perfection. Beneath the surface of her regal reign lay a careful performance of cleanliness and beauty, a performance that was as much about survival as it was about creating an unassailable throne. Elizabeth's focus on appearance was a reflection of the larger battle of her time, the battle for control, for power, and for legitimacy in a world where image often trumped reality. As we look back at her reign, we see the price she paid for this image. Elizabeth I, despite her brilliance and strength as a ruler, was not immune to the pressures of maintaining an outward facade of invincibility. Her hygiene and appearance were not mere personal choices, they were political tools. And the cost of these tools was far higher than anyone could have imagined. To understand the price of power in Elizabethan England, we need to step back and consider the world in which Elizabeth lived. The demands placed upon her as a monarch were immense. She had to remain untouchable, steadfast in her decision-making, and, above all, perfect in her appearance. This image was not just for show, it was her armor. In a time when the king or queen's public persona was tied directly to their legitimacy, Elizabeth could not afford to show vulnerability. Every portrait, every public appearance, and every ritual had to be meticulously crafted to reinforce the myth of the invincible queen. And in a world where hygiene was considered secondary, this myth required a considerable price. Elizabeth's obsession with cleanliness, or rather, the illusion of cleanliness, was central to her public image. She used perfume and powder to mask the reality of her personal hygiene habits, or lack thereof. Bathing was believed to be dangerous, opening the pores to disease, and thus was avoided. Perfume, expensive and often overpowering, became her shield. It was a shield against the reality of her physical decline, but it also served as a symbol of her royal power. In this world, where cleanliness was closely linked to morality and health, Elizabeth's deliberate choice to avoid the common practices of cleanliness reflected a larger strategic decision. She understood that power lay not in the reality of health, but in the perception of invulnerability. This reliance on appearances, however, came with a high price. Elizabeth's physical body, underneath all the makeup, perfume, and wigs, was deteriorating. The constant use of toxic makeup to maintain her pale, youthful appearance began to take a toll on her skin. Her teeth, decayed from an excessive diet of sugar, created foul breath that she worked tirelessly to mask. These personal issues were hidden from the public eye, but they were part of the cost of ruling. The more she invested in her public image, the more she had to sacrifice her personal well-being. Her reliance on perfume, the lavish gowns, the wigs, all of these were symbols of her power, but they were also a shield against her own mortality. As she aged and her body began to show the signs of wear, Elizabeth doubled down on the facade of youth and vitality. This wasn't just about vanity, it was about survival. Her power rested on her image, and to maintain that image, she had to mask her humanity. In a way, Elizabeth's body became a casualty of her rule, a testament to the cost of sustaining an empire through performance. For Elizabeth, hygiene was never just about cleanliness. It was a symbol of control. Control over her image, control over her body, and control over how others saw her. In a world where image was everything, maintaining a spotless facade was essential for her to maintain power. Hygiene was an outward sign of her sovereignty, a tool to project her divine right to rule. The act of masking body odor, applying perfumes, and coating herself in layers of makeup was a deliberate choice to demonstrate that she had command not only over her kingdom, but also over her own body. It's important to recognize that hygiene, or the illusion of cleanliness, was not merely a private affair for Elizabeth, it was an integral part of the royal spectacle. The ritualistic use of perfumes, powders, and scented oils became part of her daily routine, part of the grand performance that was Elizabeth I. She crafted herself into an image of perfection, one that her subjects could not question. Elizabeth's insistence on maintaining an image of pristine cleanliness was a way to assert her control, ensuring that no one could look beyond the surface and glimpse the frailty beneath. It was powered by appearance, and it worked. Her public image became a model for monarchs that followed, and her name became synonymous with the idea of divine and unshakable rule. But as we now know, this reliance on appearances came at a heavy price. In her attempts to manage every detail of her life, her cleanliness, her beauty, her power, Elizabeth effectively distanced herself from her own humanity. The illusion of cleanliness became a barrier, not just between her and her subjects, but between herself and the truth of her aging body. In this way, Elizabeth's hygiene was not a reflection of her personal care, but a political tool, one that she used to ensure that her image remained intact, even as her physical health deteriorated. The control Elizabeth exercised over her appearance was a necessity in her time. In an era when monarchs were seen as the embodiment of divine will, any physical imperfection was seen as a potential weakness. To preserve her image of invincibility, Elizabeth had to manage every aspect of her appearance constantly. Hygiene was just one of the many rituals she performed to reinforce her power. In doing so, she transformed hygiene from a simple matter of personal health into a performance of royal authority. Every aspect of her appearance was a carefully controlled message, sent to her subjects to remind them of her strength and superiority. The legacy of Elizabeth I, particularly in relation to her hygiene habits, is one that still fascinates historians and the public alike. Elizabeth's reign marked the apex of the English Renaissance, a time when appearance, art, and public perception played pivotal roles in politics. The performance of cleanliness that Elizabeth so meticulously maintained set the stage for future monarchs and leaders, who continued to use their public image as a tool to project power and influence. But Elizabeth's legacy goes beyond just her image. It's a reflection of the intersection between politics, appearance, and the human condition. Today, we look back on Elizabeth's hygiene habits with a mixture of awe and disbelief. In a world where cleanliness is not just a matter of appearance but of health, Elizabeth's practices seem archaic, even dangerous. Yet, in her time, her approach to hygiene was a necessity, both politically and personally. Her reliance on perfume, her avoidance of bathing, and her elaborate beauty routines were all part of a grand strategy to maintain her power. These practices, though now seen as unhealthy and unsustainable, were the very tools she used to keep her image intact and her rule unchallenged. Elizabeth's legacy is a reminder that the pursuit of power is often a performance, one that requires careful attention to detail and the manipulation of perception. Hygiene, in Elizabeth's case, was not about health, it was about maintaining control. Her image was her strength, and she would go to great lengths to protect it, even at the cost of her physical well-being. Her approach to cleanliness, then, was not just a personal quirk but a political statement. In a world where power was often wielded through appearance, Elizabeth understood that to remain unassailable, she had to be perfect in the eyes of her subjects. Her legacy also teaches us about the complexities of leadership, image, and health. In today's world, we are still deeply concerned with how we appear to others. And in many ways, Elizabeth's life serves as a warning. It's easy to get lost in the pursuit of perfection, in the desire to maintain an unblemished image. But Elizabeth's life shows us that this pursuit comes with a cost. In the end, her obsession with her appearance, while helping her maintain power, also caused personal suffering and physical decline. As we reflect on Elizabeth's life, we are reminded that power is often intertwined with perception, and that the way we present ourselves to the world can have as much impact as our actions. Elizabeth I's story is one of great triumph and great tragedy, and her legacy is a testament to the complexities of leadership, self-image, and the human spirit. As we close the chapter on Elizabeth I's reign and her relationship with cleanliness, it's impossible to ignore the striking contrasts between her world and our own. The Virgin Queen, a woman who symbolized purity, power, and glory, was also bound by the very human limitations that she so desperately sought to mask. The perfumes, powders, and elaborate routines that defined her public image were her armor protecting her from the harsh reality of mortality and decay. Beneath the golden veneer, however, lay the same frailty that afflicts us all. Elizabeth, despite her regal bearing and immortalized portraits, was just as human as anyone. She, too, had to face the inevitable decline of her health, concealed beneath layers of artifice and scent. The perfumes that followed her wherever she went were more than just fragrances. They were symbols of control, of her desire to shape her legacy. They shielded her from the harsh judgment of her time, allowing her to maintain her image of eternal youth and vitality. And yet, in doing so, they also shrouded the truth of her body's decline. The very same perfume that covered her scent of decay also hid the frailty that she struggled to conceal. Her hygiene practices, though shocking to our modern sensibilities, were a reflection of the societal pressures of her era, where a queen's appearance was paramount and where survival, both political and personal, depended on the strength of her image. In her time, cleanliness was not just a matter of personal health, it was a political statement, a way to signal power and wealth. It was a world where the appearance of being clean, pure, and untouchable was the key to maintaining a crown. Elizabeth's hygiene rituals were not just about maintaining personal hygiene. They were about controlling the narrative of her reign, projecting an image of invincibility. And this pursuit of perfection, as extreme as it may seem to us today, was essential in a time when survival meant constantly battling against both internal and external forces. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, think about the fragility of human existence and the lengths to which we go to protect our image. Even the mightiest monarchs were no exception to the natural forces of decay, but they crafted their legacies in ways that allowed them to escape the full force of mortality, if only for a time. Elizabeth's life and her obsession with appearance and cleanliness remind us that power often hides decay. Beneath the jewels, beneath the crown, there lies the scent of humanity, fragile, imperfect, and endlessly fascinating. So, as you relax into the night, remember that even queens must live with their own shadows. Their grandeur, like ours, is only temporary, but their stories live on, revealing to us the complexities of human nature. Let this reflection guide you into peaceful rest. If you've enjoyed this journey into the strange, sleepy corners of history, please like, share, and subscribe. And share this tale with others who love uncovering the unexpected layers of the past, one sleepy story at a time. Sweet dreams.